Miss Carter, if you spent half as much time listening as you do talking, maybe you wouldn't embarrass yourself so much, Mrs. Wilkins snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. Ayana's heart raced, but she refused to look away. I'm just saying, Mrs. Wilkins, the answer to question 5 is actually 1825, not 1828. I double-checked it last night. Mrs. Wilkins let out a short, mocking laugh. Oh, you double-checked it? Well, I suppose we should all bow to the wisdom of Miss Carter, the historian. She gestured theatrically to the class, her tone oozing sarcasm. The room fell silent. The other students avoided Ayana's gaze, staring at their desks or the windows, pretending not to hear the exchange. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Ayana said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I just thought it was important to correct the mistake. Important, Mrs. Wilkins shot back, taking a step closer to Ayana's desk. What's important is learning when to stay in your lane. You're always so quick to challenge me, always so sure you're right. Newsflash, Miss Carter, you're not as smart as you think you are. In fact, you're not very smart at all. The words hit Ayana like a slap. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. I'm just trying to do my best, she managed to say, her voice soft but firm. Well, your best isn't good enough, Mrs. Wilkins retorted, turning back to the whiteboard. Now, if we can move on without any more interruptions. That's not fair, Ayana interrupted, her voice rising slightly. You're always picking on me, but when other students make mistakes, you let it slide. Mrs. Wilkins froze mid-step, then turned slowly to face Ayana. Excuse me? She said, her voice low and dangerous. Ayana swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. You heard me. You don't treat everyone the same. Mrs. Wilkins' face flushed red. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? You're out of line, young lady. Mrs. Wilkins spoke to Ayana so disrespectfully and hurt her feelings in ways words cannot begin to describe. But she would realize at the end of this story how wrong she was to have treated Ayana in such a way. She would regret it deeply, but by then it would be too late. Before we get into this story, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and regard, no matter the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel to show your support and spread awareness. Now, let's get into it. Why was Mrs. Wilkins treating Ayana this way? Why did she hate her this much? So much that she could not even hide her disdain for her. To understand this, we have to go back to the very beginning of it all, where it all started. Ayana Carter was 15 years old when she and her family moved to this small town. A smart and determined girl with big dreams. She had just moved to a quiet suburban town with her family, leaving behind the lively city where she had grown up. For Ayana, change wasn't something new. Her father's job as a doctor often meant uprooting their lives and starting fresh in a new place. This time was no different. Dr. Carter had been transferred to the local hospital and the family packed up their lives once again. Ayana's mother, Mrs. Carter, worked from home as a writer. She had a quiet strength about her and always encouraged Ayana to chase her dreams. Don't let anyone tell you who you are, Ayana, her mother often said. You define yourself. Ayana took those words to heart. She was proud of who she was and excited about her future. She had a passion for math and science, subjects that came naturally to her. While other kids groaned at complex equations, Ayana saw them as puzzles waiting to be solved. She dreamed of becoming an engineer, building things that could make a difference in the world. Moving to a new town wasn't easy, though. Ayana missed her old friends and the familiarity of her old school. The new neighborhood felt too quiet, almost too perfect, with its neatly trimmed lawns and rows of identical houses. She wondered if she would fit in here. But Ayana was the kind of person who always looked for the bright side of things. It's a fresh start, she told herself. Maybe this town will be better than I think. On her first day at Lincoln High, Ayana felt both nervous and excited. The school was much smaller than her last one, and as she walked through the hallways, she noticed that most of the students didn't look like her. She had grown up in a diverse environment, but here she stood out. Still, Ayana held her head high. She was used to proving herself, and she was determined to do the same here. Ayana's confidence shined through in the classroom. She wasn't afraid to raise her hand or share her ideas, especially when it came to math and science. Her kindness made her approachable, though making friends in a new place was always a slow process. She hoped that in time, people would see her for who she really was, a bright, driven girl with a lot to offer. Little did Ayana know, someone had already noticed her, but not in the way she had hoped. Mrs. Wilkins, her history teacher, watched Ayana's enthusiasm with cold eyes. For reasons Ayana couldn't understand, Mrs. Wilkins seemed to have made up her mind not to like her. But Ayana wasn't one to back down. She was determined to prove herself, no matter what challenges came her way. On Ayana's first day at Lincoln High, she felt like she was stepping into a completely different world. The school was much smaller than her previous one, and as she walked through the bright hallways, she noticed the difference immediately. Most of the students were white, and so were the teachers. Ayana felt their eyes glance at her as she passed, but she straightened her back and smiled politely. She had promised herself that she would make the best of this new start. On that day when the morning bell rang, Ayana found her way to her first class, math. Numbers had always been her comfort zone, and the teacher, Mr. Adams, seemed friendly. Ayana raised her hand often, answering questions and contributing ideas. Some of her classmates seemed surprised by how confident and quick she was, but a few even smiled at her as she spoke. It gave her hope that she might find her place here. The day continued smoothly until Ayana reached her last class, history. The room was already half full when Ayana stepped inside. She picked a seat near the front, as she always did, wanting to stay focused. That's when she noticed the teacher, Mrs. Wilkins, standing at her desk. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a stern expression. Ayana offered her a polite, "Good morning," but Mrs. Wilkins only gave a curt nod before turning away. As class began, Ayana noticed something strange. Mrs. Wilkins called on students who gave vague or even incorrect answers, smiling at them and praising their effort. But when Ayana raised her hand, Mrs. Wilkins acted like she didn't see her. It happened again and again throughout the class. Ayana tried not to let it bother her, but by the end of the lesson, her hand stayed down. Later, during a group discussion, Ayana confidently shared her thoughts with her classmates. "Actually, I think the Louisiana Purchase had more long-term impacts on trade than military strategy," she said. But before anyone could respond, Mrs. Wilkins cut in. "Let's stick to what's in the textbook," she said sharply, moving on without acknowledging Ayana's point. By the time the bell rang, Ayana felt uneasy. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Wilkins didn't like her or if she was imagining things, but the cold, dismissive way the teacher had treated her didn't feel like a coincidence. As Ayana packed her bag, she noticed a couple of students whispering and glancing her way. She couldn't tell if they were impressed by her or siding with Mrs. Wilkins. Either way, she knew she had a long road ahead of her in this new school. Mrs. Margaret Wilkins had been teaching history at Lincoln High for over 20 years. In her mind, she was the pillar of the school, the kind of teacher who demanded respect and maintained order in her classroom. She prided herself on being tough but fair, though many students would have argued that her version of fairness was questionable at best. Margaret had grown up in a small, conservative town not far from where she now taught. Her parents had instilled in her strict values, including an outdated view of the world and the people in it. Although she rarely voiced these opinions outright, they showed in her actions. Margaret had always believed that certain students did not belong, though she never said as much out loud. She was careful not to cross any obvious lines that might jeopardize her job, but her biases influenced how she treated her students. Her classroom was her domain, and she controlled it with an iron fist. She expected students to sit quietly, follow her lead, and accept her authority without question. Margaret had little patience for students who challenged her, especially those she thought didn't fit her idea of exceptional. While she claimed to treat all students equally, it was clear to anyone paying attention that this wasn't true. She was quick to praise certain students for mediocre work while harshly criticizing others, particularly those who dared to correct her. When Ayanna Carter joined her class, Mrs. Wilkins noticed her immediately. Ayanna was confident and outspoken, traits that Margaret found annoying in any student, but especially in someone like Ayanna who was black. Margaret wouldn't have admitted it, even to herself, but Ayanna's intelligence and self-assuredness made her uncomfortable. To Margaret, Ayanna was a challenge, a student who needed to be humbled. Margaret's actions toward Ayanna were subtle but consistent. She would ignore Ayanna when she raised her hand, give her lower grades on assignments without explanation, and dismiss her contributions in class discussions. To most people, these moments might have seemed minor, but for Ayanna, they added up to something much larger, a constant reminder that Mrs. Wilkins didn't think she belonged. Despite her biases, Mrs. Wilkins saw herself as a professional. She didn't believe she was being unfair. In fact, she told herself that she was simply preparing Ayanna for the real world. But deep down, Margaret knew she was singling her out, and as much as she tried to keep her bias hidden, it was clear to Ayanna and to a few observant students. It was a typical Wednesday morning in Mrs. Wilkins' history class. She stood at the front of the room, gesturing dramatically as she spoke about the Civil War. The students listened quietly, some taking notes, others half paying attention. Ayanna, as always, sat near the front, fully focused on the lecture. History wasn't her favorite subject, but she still wanted to do well. She had spent the weekend reading extra materials about the Civil War to better understand the upcoming chapter. And, as we all know, Mrs. Wilkins said confidently, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1861, which marked the official start of the Union's fight against slavery. Ayanna furrowed her brow. That wasn't right. She had just read an article the night before that clearly stated the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should speak up, but finally raised her hand. She had been taught to respect teachers, but also to value accuracy and learning. Yes, Miss Carter, Mrs. Wilkins said, her tone already laced with irritation. I just wanted to point out that the Emancipation Proclamation was actually issued in 1863, not 1861, Ayanna said politely. It was 2 years into the war, after the Battle of Antietam. The room went silent. A few students glanced nervously between Ayanna and Mrs. Wilkins. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension that was about to unfold. Mrs. Wilkins' face hardened. She placed the marker she was holding down on her desk with deliberate force. Miss Carter, she said slowly, her voice icy, I have been teaching history for over 20 years. I think I know a little more about this subject than you do. Ayanna's cheeks burned, but she held her ground. I wasn't trying to question your knowledge, ma'am. I just thought... Well, don't think, Mrs. Wilkins snapped, cutting her off. Leave history to the experts. I don't have time to debate with students who think a quick Google search makes them scholars. Ayanna's heart sank. The sarcasm in Mrs. Wilkins's voice stung like a slap. The class remained silent, no one daring to say a word. Ayanna lowered her gaze to her notebook, fighting back tears. She wanted to disappear. Mrs. Wilkins turned back to the whiteboard, clearly satisfied with herself. As I was saying, she continued, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1861. Ayanna didn't hear the rest. Her mind was racing, the humiliation sitting heavy in her chest. For the first time, she questioned if she could endure this class. After the incident in history class, Mrs. Wilkins' treatment of Ayanna became worse. It wasn't loud or obvious. Mrs. Wilkins was too careful for that. But the subtle ways she undermined Ayanna were impossible to miss. Ayanna felt like every time she walked into class, a spotlight was on her, and not in a good way. Mrs. Wilkins began calling on Ayanna more frequently during lessons, but not to encourage her participation. Instead, she used Ayanna's answers as an opportunity to mock her. One morning, Mrs. Wilkins asked a question about the causes of World War I. Ayanna raised her hand hesitantly, unsure of what would happen, but still determined to try. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Ayana answered, her voice clear but cautious. Well, I suppose that's technically correct, Mrs. Wilkins said with a smirk. But it's not the whole picture, is it? Maybe you should stick to the basics until you're ready to tackle the details. The class went quiet, as it always did when this happened. Ayana's classmates exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. Ayana stared down at her desk, feeling the weight of their silence. In group work, things weren't much better. Mrs. Wilkins often dismissed Ayana's ideas before she even had a chance to explain them. One afternoon, the class was divided into teams to create posters about the Reconstruction era. Ayana suggested focusing on how economic policies impacted African Americans during that time. That's too complex for a simple classroom project, Mrs. Wilkins said quickly, cutting her off. Why don't you let someone else take the lead? The group ended up using another student's idea, which was far less detailed than Ayana's. She felt invisible, her thoughts and contributions brushed aside as if they didn't matter. Then there were the assignments. Ayana put extra effort into every paper and project, determined to excel despite the way she was treated. But no matter how much work she put in, Mrs. Wilkins always found something to criticize. Her essays came back with harsh comments like lacking depth or unfocused, even when Ayana followed every instruction perfectly. Other students began to notice. A few of them whispered to Ayana after class, saying things like, "I think you did great," or "I don't get why she's so hard on you." But no one was brave enough to speak up in front of Mrs. Wilkins. They were scared of becoming her next target. Ayana felt trapped, caught in a cycle of unfairness she couldn't escape. No matter what she did, it was never enough. But deep down, a small part of her refused to give up. She knew she was better than the way Mrs. Wilkins treated her, and she was determined to prove it. Did you have a teacher that did not like you or people with color? If you relate to what Ayana went through, show your support for her by subscribing to this page. At home, Ayana was no longer the bright, cheerful girl her parents knew. She spent most of her time in her room, barely coming out except for meals. When she was with her family, she spoke as little as possible, her answers short and quiet. Her parents, Dr. and Mrs. Carter, noticed the change almost immediately. It started with small things. Ayana no longer stayed at the dinner table to talk about her day. Her usual excitement about her favorite shows or hobbies had faded. The books and puzzles she loved sat untouched on her desk. Even her laughter, once so easy and natural, seemed to have disappeared. Mrs. Carter, who worked from home, was the first to grow deeply worried. She often peeked into Ayana's room during the day and found her staring at her textbooks, barely turning the pages. Sometimes Ayana just sat on her bed, her face blank and distant. "Is everything okay at school, Ayana?" Mrs. Carter asked one evening as she knocked on her daughter's door. She walked in carefully, not wanting to push too hard. Ayana was sitting at her desk, her notebook open but untouched. She looked up briefly, then back down. "It's fine," Ayana said softly. Mrs. Carter wasn't convinced. "You don't seem fine. You've been quiet lately, and you're not yourself. Your dad and I are worried about you." "I'm okay, Mom," Ayana insisted, though her voice wavered. She didn't look her mother in the eye. Mrs. Carter sat down on the edge of the bed. "Ayana, I know when something's wrong. You can talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Ayana hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her notebook. She wanted to keep it all to herself, to avoid burdening her mom. But the weight of everything she had been holding in was too much. Finally, she sighed and turned to face her mother. "It's school," she admitted quietly. "Mrs. Wilkins, she doesn't like me. She's always mean to me in class. She ignores me, makes fun of my answers, and I don't know why." Mrs. Carter's heart ached as she listened. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," Ayana said, tears forming in her eyes. "I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but it keeps happening." Mrs. Carter reached out and pulled Ayana into a hug. "It's not okay for anyone to treat you like that. We'll figure this out together. You don't have to face it alone." For the first time in weeks, Ayana felt a small sense of relief. She still didn't know what would happen, but at least now, she didn't have to carry it all by herself. One evening, Ayana sat quietly at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate. Her parents exchanged worried glances. It had been weeks since Ayana had come home excited about anything, and the spark they loved so much in her seemed to have dimmed. Mrs. Carter finally broke the silence. "Ayana," she began gently, "your dad and we've talked about it, and we think it might be time to make a change." Ayana looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated for a moment, then said, "We've been thinking about transferring you to a different school. There's no reason for you to stay somewhere that makes you feel this way." Ayana's eyes widened. "Transfer?" she repeated, her voice filled with surprise. Dr. Carter chimed in, his tone calm and supportive. "We just want what's best for you, Ayana. If Lincoln High isn't the right environment, we can look into other options. There are schools in the area with strong STEM programs. You deserve to be in a place where you feel valued and accepted." For a moment, Ayana didn't say anything. She looked down at her plate, her mind racing. The idea of starting over at a new school was tempting, but something inside her resisted. She thought about Mrs. Wilkins and the way the teacher constantly belittled her. A new school might be easier, but it wouldn't solve the problem. Running away felt like letting Mrs. Wilkins win. "No," Ayana said firmly, lifting her head. "I'm not transferring." Her parents looked surprised. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Mrs. Carter asked. "You don't have to stay in a place where you're unhappy." "I know," Ayana replied, her voice steady, "but I don't want to run away from my problems. If I leave, it'll feel like I'm letting Mrs. Wilkins think she's right about me. I want to stay and prove to her, and to everyone else, that I'm smart and capable. I can handle this. If I leave, she will just do it to someone else." Mrs. Carter leaned forward, placing a hand on Ayana's. "Ayana, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You already are smart and capable." "I know," Ayana said, a small smile appearing on her face, "but I want her to see it. I want to show her that she was wrong about me." Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "Okay, honey, we'll support you no matter what." In that moment, Ayana's determination reignited. She was ready to face her challenges head-on. If you are proud of Ayana for standing up for herself and not running away from her problems, but fighting for her right and her place, leave some words of encouragement in the comment section. One chilly morning, the principal of Lincoln High made an announcement over the loudspeakers that caught everyone's attention. The school would be participating in the annual regional science competition. Students were encouraged to join the team and represent Lincoln High. The competition was a big deal, drawing schools from across the district. Winning meant recognition, scholarships, and school pride. Ayana's ears perked up as the announcement ended. Science had always been her favorite subject, and this seemed like the perfect chance to prove herself. The idea of working on a challenging project excited her, and she couldn't help but think about how much she could contribute. Later that day, Mrs. Wilkins mentioned the competition briefly during history class. She explained that the science teacher, Mr. Reed, was organizing the team and encouraged students to sign up. Ayana's hand shot up, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Wilkins, I'd like to participate," Ayana said, her voice steady despite the usual tension in the room. Mrs. Wilkins raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "You?" she said, the disbelief evident in her tone. "This is a high-level competition, Miss Carter. It requires commitment, advanced thinking, and teamwork. Are you sure you're up for it?" Ayana's stomach sank, but she didn't back down. "Yes, I'm sure." "Well," Mrs. Wilkins said, turning back to the board dismissively, "I suppose you can try. Just don't be surprised if it's a bit too much for you." Ayana felt the familiar sting of Mrs. Wilkins' words, but this time they didn't stop her. If anything, they fueled her determination. She wasn't about to let Mrs. Wilkins define what she could or couldn't do. The next day, Ayana went to Mr. Reed's classroom after school and signed up for the team. She didn't mention Mrs. Wilkins' comments. Instead, she threw herself into the project with everything she had. The competition involved designing a solution to an environmental problem. Ayana's team chose to work on a sustainable water filtration system. Ayana quickly became the backbone of the group. She spent late nights researching, sketching designs, and testing ideas. Her teammates noticed her dedication and began relying on her for guidance. Still, Ayana kept her efforts quiet at school. She didn't want Mrs. Wilkins' negativity to discourage her teammates or herself. As the competition day drew closer, Ayana's confidence grew. She wasn't just working to win, she was working to prove, once and for all, that she belonged. As the regional science competition drew closer, Ayana became the heart of her team's project. The team's goal was to create a sustainable water filtration system, and Ayana took the lead without hesitation. She loved problem solving, and this project gave her the chance to prove not only her abilities but also her determination. Ayana was the one who tackled the toughest parts of the project. When the team struggled with the complex equations needed to calculate water flow and filtration rates, Ayana sat down with a calculator and a notebook, working through the problems until she found solutions. Her teammates were amazed at how quickly she grasped the concepts. "How do you do that so fast?" one of them asked during a late afternoon session in the school library. Ayana just smiled and shrugged. "I guess I just like math," she said modestly. She also made sure everyone had a role in the project. Ayana organized their tasks, assigning each teammate specific parts to research and design. Her leadership was natural, and though some of her teammates had been skeptical at first, they began to admire her intelligence and dedication. "We'd be lost without you," one of them admitted during a break. Ayana felt a flicker of pride but stayed focused. She knew there was still a lot of work to do. Ayana often stayed late after school, working on blueprints and fine-tuning their prototype in the science lab. Mr. Reed, the science teacher, was supportive and encouraged her to keep pushing forward. At home, Ayana spent her evenings reading scientific journals and testing different materials for the filtration system. Her room became a mini lab filled with notes, diagrams, and pieces of their prototype. Despite her growing confidence, Ayana still felt the weight of Mrs. Wilkins' dismissiveness. Every time she passed her history teacher in the hallway, Mrs. Wilkins would give her a quick glance but say nothing. Ayana couldn't help but wonder if the teacher still doubted her ability to succeed. One day during class, a teammate excitedly mentioned how well the project was coming along. "Ayana's been amazing," they said. "She's basically the reason we're on track." Mrs. Wilkins, standing at the front of the room, raised an eyebrow and gave a tight-lipped smile. "Well, let's hope all that effort actually pays off," she said, her tone flat. Ayana ignored the comment, focusing instead on what really mattered, winning the competition. Her teammates believed in her, and she believed in herself. No matter what Mrs. Wilkins thought, Ayana was determined to show everyone what she was capable of. I hope you have subscribed to my channel. Your support means a lot to me. Help spread awareness against racial bias and unkindness by hitting that subscribe button right away. The day of the regional science competition arrived, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Schools from all over the district filled the large auditorium, each team eager to prove their abilities. Ayana's school team sat together at a table near the front, their prototype carefully displayed for the judges to see. Ayana felt a mix of nerves and excitement, but she kept reminding herself of how much work they had put into the project. They were ready. The first round involved presenting their project to the judges. Ayana and her teammates took turns explaining their water filtration system, detailing how it worked and why it was sustainable. Ayana led the most technical parts, confidently breaking down the complex equations and scientific principles. The judges nodded in approval, impressed by her knowledge and clarity. By the end of the presentation, her team felt proud. But the competition wasn't over yet. The final round was a live challenge, designed to test each team's ability to think on their feet. Each group was given a hypothetical problem to solve, using their project as the foundation. Ayana's team was assigned a scenario involving a contaminated water source in a small village. They had to design adjustments to their system to handle unexpected impurities. The problem was tough, and time was limited. Ayana's teammates huddled around the table, their voices overlapping as they brainstormed. Ideas were thrown out, some good, others too complicated to execute. The clock was ticking, and frustration began to creep in. "I don't think this is going to work," one teammate muttered, his voice tense. "We're running out of time." Ayana took a deep breath, scanning the problem sheet again. She quickly started sketching a new design on a piece of paper, her mind racing through calculations. "What if we add an extra carbon filter here?" she said, pointing to her drawing. "It'll catch the impurities we're worried about without slowing down the water flow." Her teammates stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "That could work," one of them said. Together, they adjusted their prototype to fit Ayana's solution, explaining it to the judges with just minutes to spare. When the results were announced, Ayana's team held their breath. "And first place goes to Lincoln High," the announcer declared. The room erupted in applause as Ayana's team jumped to their feet, cheering and hugging one another. Ayana felt a rush of pride as the judges handed her the trophy. She had proven herself not just to Mrs. Wilkins, not just to her teammates, but to everyone. It was her moment, and no one could take it away. Ayana is proof that you can achieve anything, even if people do not believe in you. If you agree, share your thoughts in the comments and hit the subscribe button. The moment Ayana and her team walked back into Lincoln High with their first place trophy, the hallways were alive with whispers and excitement. Word had already spread about their win at the regional science competition, and Ayana's name was at the center of every conversation. Students who had barely noticed her before now smiled at her as she passed, some even stopping to congratulate her. Her teammates couldn't stop singing her praises. "Ayana was the reason we won," one of them said during lunch. "She solved that final problem like it was nothing. We were all stuck, but she figured it out in minutes." Another chimed in, "She's a genius, honestly. We couldn't have done it without her." The attention was new for Ayana, but it felt good. For the first time since starting at Lincoln High, she felt truly seen. Not just as another student, but as someone who had made an impact. The science teacher, Mr. Reed, proudly displayed the trophy in the school's trophy case, making sure to point out Ayana's leadership to anyone who walked by. Even the principal mentioned her during the morning announcements. "Congratulations to our science team for their incredible performance at the regional science competition. A special shout out to Ayana Carter for her outstanding contributions. You've made Lincoln High proud." While the school celebrated, Mrs. Wilkins sat quietly in her classroom, marking papers as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she couldn't ignore what she had heard. The staff room buzzed with talk of Ayana's brilliance, and the other teachers couldn't stop praising her. "I didn't realize how talented she was," one teacher remarked. "She's going places." Mrs. Wilkins forced a smile and nodded, but she felt a pang of guilt. She had underestimated Ayana from the start, dismissing her intelligence and determination. Her mind replayed all the times she had ignored Ayana's raised hand, mocked her answers, or dismissed her ideas. Now the same student she had looked down on was being celebrated by everyone around her. That afternoon, as Mrs. Wilkins watched Ayana walk into her history class, she felt a rare moment of self-awareness. Ayana held her head high, her confidence shining through. The other students glanced at her with newfound respect, some even whispering as she took her seat. Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat and began the lesson, but her usual sharpness was gone. She couldn't bring herself to dismiss Ayana or undermine her anymore. For the first time, Mrs. Wilkins truly realized she had been wrong about Ayana all along. It wasn't just Ayana's brilliance that had stunned her. It was her resilience, her ability to rise above the negativity and prove her worth. Ayana's victory at the regional science competition brought more than just a trophy to Lincoln High. It opened doors for her that she hadn't even dreamed of yet. A few weeks after the competition, the organizers sent a letter to the school announcing that Ayana had been selected for a prestigious scholarship program for future STEM leaders. The scholarship would cover a significant portion of her college tuition, along with mentorship opportunities and access to summer programs at top universities. When the principal called Ayana to his office to share the news, she was stunned. "Ayana, this is a testament to your hard work and talent," he said, smiling warmly. "You're an inspiration to this school and beyond." The announcement of Ayana's scholarship was made during a school assembly. Standing on the stage in front of her peers, Ayana felt nervous but proud as the principal introduced her. "Today we recognize Ayana Carter not just for her remarkable achievements at the regional science competition, but for her dedication, intelligence, and leadership," he said. "She has earned a scholarship that will pave the way for her bright future in STEM. Ayana, you've made Lincoln High proud." The auditorium erupted in applause. Ayana stood tall, smiling, as the principal handed her a certificate of recognition. Among the crowd, she noticed younger students, especially a few black girls, looking at her with admiration in their eyes. She realized that her accomplishment wasn't just for herself. It was a message to others like her that they, too, could achieve great things. After the assembly, students approached her in the hallways, congratulating her and asking questions about her project. Some younger students even asked her for advice about science and math. Ayana started to feel like a role model. She began mentoring younger students she took seriously, encouraging them to pursue their interests and work hard despite any challenges they faced. While most of the school celebrated Ayana's success, Mrs. Wilkins felt a mix of emotions. Sitting in the audience during the assembly, she had clapped politely, but the principal's praise of Ayana made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. She couldn't deny the recognition Ayana deserved, but it reminded her of how wrong she had been. She avoided eye contact with Ayana as she walked past her classroom later that day. Ayana, however, paid no mind to Mrs. Wilkins' discomfort. For the first time in months, she felt truly free, free from doubt, free from judgment, and ready to embrace the future ahead of her. In the days following the school assembly, Mrs. Wilkins found herself reflecting on Ayana Carter more than she cared to admit. Every time she passed the trophy case, where the shining award from the regional science competition sat proudly, she was reminded of Ayana's remarkable talent. It wasn't just Ayana's intelligence that stood out, it was her resilience, her ability to rise above the challenges Mrs. Wilkins herself had created. For the first time in years, Mrs. Wilkins questioned her own actions. She had always justified her behavior by telling herself she was preparing students for the real world, but deep down, she knew she had been unfair to Ayana. It was bias, plain and simple, and Ayana had proven just how wrong she had been. One afternoon, Mrs. Wilkins stayed behind after class, waiting for Ayana to finish packing her bag. As the other students filtered out, she cleared her throat. "Miss Carter, could I have a word with you?" Ayana looked up surprised. "Yes, ma'am," she said cautiously, standing near her desk. Mrs. Wilkins hesitated, something she rarely did. She folded her hands together and took a deep breath. "I wanted to talk to you about the way I've treated you this year." Ayana stood still, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Wilkins continued, her voice softer than usual. "I know I haven't been fair to you. I've dismissed your ideas, ignored your efforts, and said things I shouldn't have. I let my own biases get in the way of seeing your potential, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Ayana blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected apology. For months, she had endured Mrs. Wilkins' harshness, and now here was her teacher, admitting fault. "I'm not proud of how I acted," Mrs. Wilkins said, her tone genuine. "You've shown incredible strength and intelligence, Ayana. I hope you can forgive me." Ayana took a moment to process her words. Her instinct was to be wary, but she could see that Mrs. Wilkins' apology was sincere. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Wilkins," Ayana said quietly. "I forgive you." Mrs. Wilkins nodded, relief washing over her face. "I'll do better, Ayana. You deserve respect, and I'll make sure you get it from now on." Ayana gave a small smile, though a part of her remained cautious. Forgiveness was one thing, but trust would take time. Still, she appreciated the gesture and hoped Mrs. Wilkins would truly change. For now, Ayana's focus was on the future, and she wasn't going to let anything hold her back. After her victory at the regional science competition, Ayana began to transform. The quiet determination she once carried turned into a confident energy that others couldn't help but notice. She walked the hallways of Lincoln High with her head held high, no longer feeling invisible. For the first time since moving to the town, she truly felt like she belonged. Her success not only earned her recognition, but also inspired her to help others. Ayana noticed that many students struggled with math and science, subjects that came naturally to her. She wanted to give back, to help those who felt like they couldn't succeed. With encouragement from Mr. Reed, Ayana decided to start a club for students who needed extra support. She called it the STEM Squad. The club met twice a week after school in the science lab. Ayana made sure it was a welcoming space where students could ask questions without fear of judgment. She spent hours preparing worksheets, creating fun challenges, and finding simple ways to explain complex concepts. Her goal was to show others that learning could be enjoyable, not something to dread. At first, only a handful of students joined, but word quickly spread about how helpful Ayana was. More students started coming, and soon, the lab was buzzing with activity during every meeting. Ayana didn't just teach them, she encouraged them, building their confidence and showing them they were capable of more than they thought. Through the club, Ayana made new friends. Students who had once been hesitant to approach her now looked up to her as both a mentor and a peer. One of the girls in the club, a shy freshman named Lily, told Ayana one day, "I used to think I'd never understand math, but you made it make sense. Thank you." Moments like that reminded Ayana why she started the club in the first place. Helping others succeed gave her a sense of purpose and joy that she hadn't felt before. Outside of the club, Ayana found herself growing even more outspoken in her classes. She no longer hesitated to share her ideas or correct mistakes, even when it meant challenging authority. Her confidence inspired others to speak up as well, creating a more open and respectful atmosphere in her classes. Ayana's growth wasn't just about academics. It was about finding her place and making an impact. She had turned a difficult situation into an opportunity to shine, and now she was helping others do the same. For the first time, Lincoln High felt like home. Over the weeks that followed, Mrs. Wilkins began reevaluating her teaching methods. She made an effort to listen to every student, calling on those she once overlooked. She encouraged questions and valued every voice in the classroom, regardless of who it came from. Though change wasn't easy, Mrs. Wilkins was committed to becoming a better teacher. Ayana had taught her an important lesson. Potential wasn't something you could judge at a glance. It was something you nurtured. Discrimination is a quiet but powerful force, often hiding in the subtle ways people treat one another. Mrs. Wilkins's actions toward Ayana Carter were rooted in preconceived notions, assumptions that blinded her to Ayana's true potential. Her bias nearly dimmed the light of a brilliant young girl, someone who only wanted the chance to be seen and valued for her abilities. Ayana's story is a reminder of the harm that comes from judging others based on surface-level perceptions. When we fail to look beyond our assumptions, we risk missing the extraordinary gifts that each person has to offer. Ayana proved that resilience, determination, and self-belief could break through barriers, but not everyone should have to work so hard to be treated fairly. Fairness and kindness should be the foundation of every interaction. By giving others the opportunity to shine and supporting their growth, we create a world where potential is not overlooked, but celebrated. Every student, every person, deserves the chance to succeed without the weight of unfair judgment holding them back. Ayana's journey didn't just change her life, it changed her school, her peers, and even Mrs. Wilkins. It's proof that with understanding and fairness, everyone has the power to rise. Ayana Carter's journey at Lincoln High was one of resilience, determination, and triumph. Despite the challenges she faced, Ayana refused to let bias or mistreatment define her. She rose above it all, proving not just her intelligence, but her strength of character. By the time she graduated high school with honors, Ayana had become a symbol of inspiration for students across the school. Her success didn't end with high school. Ayana's scholarship paved the way for her to attend a top university, where she continued to excel in math and science. She never forgot her experiences at Lincoln High, using them as motivation to break barriers and create opportunities for others. Her story encouraged countless students, especially those who felt overlooked, to believe in their potential and fight for their dreams. As Ayana packed her bags for college, the lessons of her journey stayed with her. She had not only overcome the challenges of prejudice, but had also left a lasting impact on those around her. Ayana's story is a powerful reminder that resilience and kindness can overcome even the toughest obstacles. It shows the world that when we choose to embrace diversity and recognize potential, everyone has the chance to thrive. If you enjoy these types of heartfelt stories about justice, kindness, and equality, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next story when it drops. I'd like to give a shout out to this subscriber, Taze311. If you would like a shout out in my next story, hit the subscribe button and comment, give me a shout out.